Springville, Utah, is a small and quaint city on the outskirts of the city Provo. This city, like many in Utah along the Wasatch Front, is nested into the foothills of Rocky Mountains. This city has exceptional beauty and a very affluent atmosphere, also known as Art City. For many who live in Springville, this is, or was, an oasis away from the busy cities in the area, and much more rural than your average city, which made it a great place at one time to own horses and to do various types of farming. In the surrounding areas, that life is still a reality, and the local rodeo is only one town away in Spanish Fork. However, apart from the beautiful geography, the town of Springville, Utah has started to become overran with a busier atmosphere. Recently, the city put up for a vote the building of a recreation center to replace the old public pool. This massive project brought in a lot of desired recreational services, classes and facilities. The citizens of Springville agreed to a bond that, over the time of repayment, including interest and principal, will cost the citizens over $34 million. That is if all goes as planned, and there is no refinancing of the debt or future borrowing. Beyond the taxpayers getting an additional property tax for this bond, there is also a lot more traffic in the area.
An official has a chance to benefit personally should they be allowed to vote.
A group of residents in Springville say their city councilman could make a pile of money if a development is allowed to go in, and when the councilman said he would not be recusing himself, the call came to get Gephardt to investigate. Matt.
Shauna Marquez, the state and really the whole country struggle with what to do about out-of-control home prices. Many cities are looking at possibly allowing some large apartments and condos to be built in their neighborhoods. Inevitably, the folks who live there have been crying, "Not in my backyard," and have been trying to do what they can to make their elected officials block the projects. Well, in Springville, that includes pointing out that if a development is allowed, one of the elected officials who allowed it could make some money. Some of the folks who live around this patch of land in Springville do not like what is trying to move in.
We're talking about 3-story apartments.
A developer wants to put in high-density buildings that could sleep dozens of families. But Karen Ifediba worries it will bring too much traffic.
But you can see what size of a road this is.
Before ground can be broken on the apartments, though, the area must be rezoned. Currently, only small homes or duplexes can be built here. Karen says that a straw poll of the city council makes it seem like the developer is likely to get the votes.
They've been jumping through hoops to try to make sure this goes through.
Among the council members who seem amiable to rezoning, Councilman Craig Jensen.
I'm for, creating places for people to live.
But the folks who called me don't think Councilman Jensen should be voting at all. You see, like many elected officials, he has a job out in the real world. When he is not Councilman Jensen, he is Business Developer Jensen for Sunrock, a company that sells building materials. So if he votes yes and the development does go forward, there is at least a chance that he and his company could profit. Does that give you any pause then about voting?
Not as a city councilman.
Does it give you any pause about recusing yourself?
No. Is there a conflict of interest here? No.
Recusing himself would not be unprecedented. City records show that when discussing the development, the former mayor did not comment in a meeting because he was partners with some developers. Still, Councilman Jensen says there is no guarantee that his company would win a potential future bid and actually gain anything, and he also insists he leaves his civil profession at the council chamber doors.
Both with Walmart and other big box retailers coming into the area, but now also a huge public recreation center. With all of this change in Springville, there has been a huge loss of the agricultural atmosphere and that rural down-to-earth community is now becoming more and more affluent, and wealth has replaced middle-class housing development projects. Homes of nearly $1 million are being built by the hundreds, and now there is a sketchy new vibe of people competing with the Joneses, so to speak. With these radical changes in culture in just 30 or 40 years, has also affected the antisocial behavior in the area. From competing in high school for the pecking order, to competing as an adult in a similar way, but in other community roles, such as in business, religious callings, and related roles. It creates an air of depression and unsatisfaction. This has been evident by the massive amount of prescription drugs that Utah's state uses, but also smaller towns and sort of more rural areas that are even more affected than by the city life. The dystopian and sort of depressing atmosphere shows up in other ways as well, such as having very high suicide rates. The suicide rates fluctuate in Utah, but for the last 40 years at least, Utah has always been in the top 10 states for high suicide rates. As of 2018, Utah was 5 out of 50 states for suicide overall, and even high in teen suicide rates, and where the leading cause of death for children ages 10 through 17. Dr. Kurt Canning, the former director of the Utah Psychiatric Association, labeled one of the dystopian side effects of this unique Utah culture the Mother of Zion syndrome. From a 2002 article, Drive Canning said about the high prescription drug usage and the depression and suicide issue in Utah.
In Mormondom, there is a social expectation, particularly among the females, to put on a mask, say yes to everything that comes at her and hide the misery and pain. I call it the Mother of Zion syndrome. You are supposed to be perfect because Mrs. Smith across the street can do it, and she has 3 more kids than you and her hair is always in place. I think the cultural issue is very real. There is the expectation that you should be happy, and if you're not happy, you're failing.
This does seem reflected of many LDS church policies after learning more about their policies on October 13, 1999, when the LDS Church sued Utah Lighthouse Ministries over releasing parts of the Bishop Handbook. In the end, Sandra and Gerald Tanner prevailed in this blatant attempt to censor someone. But the findings inside that manual, and also in many other policies surrounding church court and temple bishop meetings with members, the church doctrine, even and most definitely including the Word of Wisdom doctrine and Covenants 89, is very strict, and usually the consequences that come with breaking these rules is mostly ostracization to various extents. Mormons believe sometimes that distance makes the heart grow fonder, and various levels of punishment can go all of the way to excommunication. What social and economic effects that has on a person varies greatly. One thing that is fairly obvious to me is that when the culture sort of agrees on something, that it is best to go along with it, or at least keep your mouth shut. I know people like private conversation between friends who agree, and there is some level of counterculture in Utah. However, the counterculture has always been very weak in Utah. Very little resistance to the status quo. In places like Springville, where the large majority of the religious demographics is Mormon, it is even more important to follow those simple instructions. Some to continue to resist, and some even gain powerful voices in the community, prior to releasing art or reporting that is counter to the culture, and then they are quickly silenced. It could not be any more obvious than what happened with the September 6 and September 1993. Or later what happened with Grant Palmer, a church historian and the former director of the SIS, or also known as the church education system, for 30 years. The consequences of speaking out against the Mormon rule in Utah vary, often based on geography. It is beginning to look like those who are turning to drugs are passing by very safe and effective herbs like cannabis in favor of taking prescription medications. It appears that the shunning of drugs in Utah and the legal consequences of using various herbs in Utah is pushing people from safe and natural substances like cannabis to very toxic and deadly substances like prescription drugs. In an ideal environment, the lawmakers would take the profit motive out of illegal drugs and put the illegal drugs in the free market, where cartels and gangs do not have a profit motive to get involved with widely used substances like cannabis. The laws in Utah affect small towns like Springville, Utah drastically. This is the City Council meeting minutes from Springville City Council meeting March 8, 2008.
This is from a Springville City Council meeting March 18, 2008. CL. Jolly commented that he can see two real issues. One is that prescription drugs are higher than the state and county average by 0.7%. Mr. Bird agreed. Lieutenant Karen agreed that the incidence has increased over the years. He has seen a steady increase. CL. Jolly observed that prescription drugs are not seen as dirty drugs in the DARE program. Lieutenant Karen commented that these drugs come from doctors. Parents make them accessible to their children. Mr. Bird observed that the need is to change attitudes. Adults have learned to ask for drugs by name from advertising. He emphasized that Springville's incidence is less than 10%. This amount is half the rates of the nation. Mayor Mangum asked why Springville is worst in the state for prescription drugs. Lieutenant Karen pointed out that Springville's rates are statistically insignificant, although there is more problem now than in the past. Mr. Conover suggested that doctors are overprescribing. Mr. Bird reported that the doctors have an ethical obligation to take care of pain. That is small clip of this meeting. The rest of the meeting minutes from March 18, 2008 can be found at www.utahpirateradio.com.
It seems that the problem is only getting worse, as national and state statistics show no sign of slowing.